This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where my guest is author and activist Ellen Miles. Ellen is the founder of Nature is a Human Right. She runs Dream Green, a social enterprise that helps people get guerrilla gardening with guides, grants and workshops, and has a book that will be released this Thursday, the 8th of June, Get Guerrilla Gardening, a handbook for planting in public places. I'm speaking to Ellen about how to get into guerrilla gardening yourself.
I got into gardening through quite a long route around. So my background was not super in environmentalism. I was on the board of a charity called Global Action Plan for a while, but more as a kind of consultant on their campaigning. I had a job just in marketing for most of my, the start of my career. And then I had a bit of a crisis of heart, like a bit of an existential crisis, and decided to quit. And I wanted to realign to something more, this is already rambling, sorry. I basically decided that I wanted to shift careers to something that I felt was more purpose-led. So I quit my job at the end of 2019, and I started this course in 2020 on how to start a social enterprise. And obviously in 2020, that is when lockdown and all of the kind of COVID hell came crashing down around us, and was also the time obviously where lots of people were shut out of nature. So lots of people don't have gardens, and in those areas, you know, the less funded areas, people were flocking to parks, and so they were closing parks in those areas, so people really had no green space to go to. And I got annoyed at that, and I started a campaign called Nature is a Human Right, which exists to literally petition the United Nations to recognise daily exposure to green environments as a right and not a privilege. Obviously, that's a very long-term, very top-down goal. So I wanted to do something more tangible and more immediate that I could do to make a difference in my neighbourhood, for the people around me and for myself. And so I started guerrilla gardening because it was something I could do to bring more nature to my neighbourhood immediately. I was actually working for council at the time, so I had a bit of an understanding of maybe why going down the council route wasn't necessarily the best way of going around things. So yeah, I started my first experiences of gardening. You know, I didn't grow up in a household where gardening was really involved in my upbringing. So my first experiences of gardening were literally gardening in the streets. And so it wasn't that I came to guerrilla gardening as a fully fledged gardener. I learned gardening through guerrilla gardening. And I think that's actually informed the book quite a lot, because I'm not coming at it from a perspective, I'm coming at it having learned from scratch, which I think is helpful to other people who are learning from scratch.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, like you say, coming at it from a totally different perspective in terms of experience, and maybe not a traditional horticultural route, is very good at giving you a place from which to examine the received wisdom around horticulture. So I think that guerrilla gardening couldn't be much more rebellious and tradition breaking. But maybe could you just explain what guerrilla gardening is for anybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So guerrilla gardening is the practice of adding plants to your neighbourhood in any suitable space you can find. And what's suitable to me is something that's near to where you live, because number one, it'll be easier to maintain that way, and that's really important. But also it's important to kind of, you know, start where you are, as the saying goes, and not kind of go and be a saviour in someone else's neighbourhood. So find somewhere near to you, and that could be bare soil or it could be concrete on which you kind of put planters. And the second thing it should be is somewhere that's kind of a bit lifeless currently, a bit devoid of life. Maybe the council made a bed and they've neglected it or just abandoned it, or perhaps there's someone that's never had any life there. Maybe it's just a tree bed that's got nothing at the root of it, and start adding in suitable plants.
Yeah. And so is it council owned land that you're looking for in this context?
So I'm just looking for public places. So I don't really think there's much use guerrilla gardening in places that people can't access, because I think it's a form of direct action which benefits the community and the kind of climate as well. So I would always guerrilla garden in places where everyone in the neighbourhood can get involved or feel the benefit of it, and also that kind of means you're not going to be trespassing or anything like that. So typically that is council owned land. I mean, often it's really hard to say who kind of owns the land, but I think if it's your community, if it's your neighborhood, if it's where you live, where you've put down your roots. So I live in Hackney, and I grew up in Hackney. I live on a street 2 streets down from the hospital I was born in. And so although it is, yes, the council's land, is it not also the community's land? I don't think I kind of talk a bit about in the book how I don't think guerrilla gardening is necessarily gardening on land that's you don't have a right to, because I do actually think the community should have an innate right to kind of take ownership over their shared environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But I suppose in the eyes of the law, is that the case? Are you potentially crossing legal boundaries when you do it?
The law question is a very interesting one because it is a grey area, and there's not, to my knowledge, there are no laws that specifically prohibit the act of planting in public places. There are kind of bylaws and other laws that could be associated with guerrilla gardening. So, for instance, public nuisance, trespass, vandalism is one. People could argue that you're kind of defacing public property, but I think you kind of don't have a leg to stand on if you're saying that beautifying a spot that was completely derelict beforehand is vandalism. I would say letting things go to rack and ruin is the kind of vandalism in that situation. So it's not technically illegal. Some people like to define guerrilla gardening in terms of guerrilla gardening where you don't have permission to, where you don't have rights to, but councils, from one council to the next, there'll be slightly different rules. Even councils are often inconsistent within themselves. So like from 1 month to another, or, maybe they've just not communicated well internally. So Hackney had this thing where they said, we're welcoming everyone planting in street tree beds. And so loads of people did. And then a year later, they tore it all up. So councils don't necessarily even know their own policies. And so I think it is this kind of liminal space in legality, which we can kind of use to our benefit. I think luckily attitudes are really shifting towards the positive, and guerrilla gardening is looked on by most kind of local authorities, lawmakers, as a good thing. It certainly takes time and strain off them to be doing the screening, which is often an excuse for them not to be. So it's not specifically illegal. But yeah, it's often hard to know exactly what it is your council does think about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it is great that it's becoming more positively viewed by councils. It was interesting what you said at the start about being a place that people could go during lockdown, especially when parks were locked, which is absolutely outrageous. But if it's a place where it's used for recreation, then it's presumably more of an ornamental space. But is there the argument as well for growing food in these spaces, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge reason that lots of people get into guerrilla gardening. I mean, the brilliant thing about guerrilla gardens is there are so many different reasons to do it. Like it can be kind of beautifying or creating a community gathering space, but it absolutely can be a tool for food sovereignty. And Incredible Edible kind of grew out of guerrilla gardens, or propaganda gardens as they called it. And they're a nationwide network of community food growing. And lots of guerrilla gardeners, so for instance, Ron Finley in LA, and the guy called the Cabbage Bandit in South Africa, they started planting in the streets as a means to provide nutrition and to, alleviate the cost of living for people in their neighborhoods. And guerrilla gardening is very much tied into kind of these land rights and this food sovereignty movement, 100%.
And that's, for me, throws up another question. Obviously, you have this space. Somebody comes along and identifies it as a potential site for growing. And then at that point, how can you get buy-in from the community in terms of making sure that you're not doing something that's going to annoy people and you are making something that people are going to appreciate and use as well?
I mean, there's lots of ways you can go around it. So you can reach out on Nextdoor, which is kind of the neighborhood social media network. You can kind of plug into your local people on there. You can literally go around handing out leaflets, door knocking and posting things through and saying, we're going to be doing, as a council would, doing a community consultation and saying, join our WhatsApp group or join our Facebook group and we can have a chat about, what you think and get people's input. I think there's likely always going to be someone who disagrees with what you're doing. But if you can kind of bring as many people in as possible and make people feel seen and heard and included, And yeah, you don't want to be replicating what the council is doing and just kind of doing things to people or sort of at people. The more you can involve people, the better, which is another great reason that guerrilla gardening should be sort of hyper local. So maybe, you focus on just bringing your street together or just your side of the street. It's much easier than trying to do that if you're doing it far away from where you live.
I'm sure. And also thinking about picking a site before you actually get going, are there any sites that you think should be left alone? And I'm thinking perhaps things that are more wild spaces.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I think guerrilla gardening is really shifting towards being a movement for guerrilla rewilding. And I think, whereas in the past, people might have wanted to like tidy up wilder spaces and make them look more like traditional gardens. I think now it's really shifting towards, okay, guerrilla gardening is about adding plants to places where they are currently lacking. So if there is a place that's already thriving with all this like beautiful biodiversity, wild biodiversity, leave it. I think it has to be a spot that's been left somewhat lifeless. And that is the ideal kind of place to focus on. So it's always about kind of turning a kind of grayer area into a greener area rather than trying to end up with something too neat. That's my philosophy on it anyway.
Another thing that you mentioned in your book in terms of designing the space and what you might use it for was a parklet, which I'd not heard of. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, a parklet is just a sort of a little park and there's lots of ways you can do it. There is an organisation in London, actually, there's the London Parklet campaign, which campaigns for parking spaces. So it's called a parklet because number one, it's like a small park, but also they put them into parking spaces. So taking over a parking space and turning it into a seating area, complete with all of these lovely plants. There's one near me that is got a herb garden in it. There's a day once a year where it started this, I think it started in San Francisco, they call it International Parking Day, where they take over parking spaces and turn them into these pop-up parks. And I think councils have slightly appropriated the term parklets and will create kind of small mini green spaces that people can come and use as a community. But it is just this idea of a very small park-esque space where anyone in the community can go and kind of use it as like a third space. It's not home, it's not work, it's not somewhere where you have to pay to exist, as a lot of spaces are at the moment. And you can create them in densely populated urban areas where it's not really possible to create, a park. Unfortunately, we can't just kind of like plonk a Hyde Park down in the middle of everyone's neighborhood. So it's just a nice way of creating these spaces in very urbanized areas.
And thinking about the practical element, so, you've identified your site, you've decided with the help of other people what you're going to do on it. And reading your book about the planting in particular, I thought it's really interesting because you must have to achieve a balance between finding plants that you can establish either from seed or as plants and then keep them going. But any plant that can do that successfully without a massive amount of input and in a potentially challenging location is going to have to be something fairly tenacious. But then obviously you have that problem ongoing with maintenance and that plant particularly becoming invasive. How do you juggle that?
So I think the straightforward solution to all of that is just to use plants that are native to the area and plants that are adapted to the conditions that you're putting them in. So, it's not going to become invasive if you're not planting invasive species. It's not going to fail to survive in the conditions that you're planting it in if it's been, adapting to those conditions over thousands of years. So if you can use native wildflowers, for instance, they're already extremely resilient, and things that we've typically considered of as weeds are really good examples of this. So borage, for instance, I think people are kind of waking up to the benefits, the kind of medicinal and herbal benefits of a lot of these plants that we've overlooked or, kind of mislabeled for centuries. And I think part of the kind of guerrilla gardening mindset is to garden in a resilient and regenerative way so that you can make your life a bit easier for yourself. It is possible to put in plants that do need a lot of maintenance. You just have to kind of be on hand then to cart water from your front door to wherever your guerrilla bed is and back again, which is no problem if you're kind of willing to do that. I guess the question is just how much effort do you want to put in? And if you want a kind of low maintenance garden, then just pick plants that are going to be low maintenance from the outset.
That's a really interesting point because obviously you will have hurdles, I suppose, such as not having any water and nowhere to store your tools. And then, as you mentioned in the book, not even anywhere to sit down when you're having a break from doing maintenance or planting. Are these all things that can be overcome relatively easy, or does it depend on the site? Is it sometimes more challenging?
Yeah, so I mean, I've used all sorts of things to cart water and tools around. The sort of we pull along citizen cane trolleys, or a shopping trolley, or just having a bunch of friends on hand. The more people you can kind of get involved, it is absolutely possible to grow a garden on your own, and I love to do it sometimes like that. But obviously, if you get all hands on deck, you can get a lot more done. And then it is possible for like everyone to bring your own trowel, bring a set of gloves, and everyone bring a big water bottle, and that way you can all muck in and it's not super difficult. In terms of place to sit down, I mean, yeah, it's not like sitting in your own kind of like lovely garden, but if you're with your mates, you've got some music on, you can kind of just like hang around, sit in the street for a bit, just as long as you're not obviously obstructing paths and getting in everyone's way and being a nuisance. You just need to put a little bit more planning into it, make yourself a little checklist of all the things you need, make sure you've got some way of getting it there and getting it back. And once you start guerrilla gardening, you might soon realize on your first day of action that you've forgotten something that is essential. So maybe you've forgotten bin bags, or maybe you haven't brought any water for yourself to drink, or maybe you didn't bring any music and it's you want to kind of keep the vibe up, whatever it is. Once you've kind of been doing this for a while, you'll soon know all the things you need, and then it's just second nature. Like I don't even really think about it anymore. I've got a rubble bucket that I just shove everything in. That bucket then gets filled up with water and then carts around when we need to. So it's just a little bit of extra planning, but it's worth it, and it's not actually too much to think about.
No. And in terms of maintenance as well, I'm assuming that is where it's really useful to have got the buy-in of local people and to have, as you say, got perhaps a group of people behind you so that you can share the load when it comes to maintaining it. But are there really good ways that you can employ to ensure that a garden continues to thrive once it has established?
I mean, definitely getting community buy-in is a huge one, but I think that's quite an easy one. Most of the time when I'm out gardening with the kind of Dream Green group, people will pass by and be like, this is amazing, how can I get involved? I want to come and add a plant in here, I'll water this next time I go along. Normally there is just this, and people have then kind of ended up joining our group as a result of that. In terms of keeping the garden flourishing, I mean, it's just a case of first observing and then kind of making whatever changes need to be done on that. I think observation is the cornerstone really of any regenerative practice, and letting nature lead and kind of letting the plants tell you what's working, what's not working, what they need, seeing the site over different times of day and different times of the year. I can't give any one size fits all advice, unfortunately, but it's certainly a case of listening to the patch, and also bringing the community in to help you keep it watered for sure.
Yeah. I think another challenge that you might face, and I've faced this myself when I've done gardens in urban areas basically, is that you sometimes have people who come along, pinch plants or kick stuff over. Yeah. Is there a good way of dealing with that as well?
If there is, I've not found the magic solution. And there's still people that will chuck glitter into planters that I've created. There's still people that will kind of like kick. I had one of the planters that I built, someone kicked the side of it in. There's always going to be people in the community who, well, I see that more as my failing than as theirs, because that means I've not done a good enough job of making everyone in the community feel included and make them feel like this is their space too. I think people have that reaction against things when they feel like there's kind of nice things happening that they're not involved in, or that they're being excluded from. So I guess the trick there is not to kind of try to chastise those people or to, put up angry signs against them, but to try and work out how to bring them in and make them feel more involved. You can put signs up just kind of explaining what the garden is and what you're doing, and that should deter more people from trashing it. If they can see, the community have come together to build this, it's not kind of, I think that does help more than people thinking it's a council initiative. But always, I don't know, trying to involve everyone. I also think there is the kind of broken windows theory, right? So like if you don't visit your site often and pick the litter, then litter's going to accumulate and more people are going to start throwing their rubbish into it. Same with if it's falling down, if it's looking a bit dilapidated, a bit overgrown. You've got to kind of keep on top of it so that people can see that it's an intentional cultivated space rather than something that's making their neighborhood sort of look worse off.
Yeah, absolutely. What really appeals to me about this is if you try to do this kind of thing in a formal setting and on a formally organised basis, you would have, particularly because it's a public area, paperwork coming out of your ears. And you don't, I think, if you're guerrilla gardening, but there are things I presume people do need to be aware of. I mean, in your book, you've got examples of some amazing spaces, but people have done things like built planters. And if somebody then comes down the street and trips over that planter or gets a splinter from it, is there a question of liability there?
I would imagine that is when you are open to charges of public endangerment, public nuisance. But I have taken great pains in the book to go through all the ways that you can really try and avoid that. It's really important to keep paths clear for wheelchairs, especially because, everyone has the right to be able to use these streets. And you need to be really considerate when you're planting. I think bringing more voices in from the community, as many kind of different perspectives as you can from the outset when you're building that, will mean that you don't have those like blind spots when you're building stuff, and you won't end up creating something that's going to be a barrier for someone. And yeah, always make sure that things are securely fastened. You don't want anything like dropping on anyone's head. You can't just be slapdash about this. Guerrilla gardening is definitely, low cost. It's got a DIY attitude. But we owe it to ourselves to represent the movement, and we owe it to our, local community to make sure that what we're doing looks and is kind of structurally sound, and, beyond that, looks great and looks kind of like a nice thing and not some kind of scrappy rubbish thing. So yeah, I mean, always sand edges, don't leave rusty nails jagged out. If you're deconstructing a pallet, for instance, make sure you've pulled out all the old nails. Just be really considerate, and always consider who else is going to be in the space and how it might affect them.
There's a lot to be said for adopting that attitude, I think, across the board anyway. So I think this just reinforces and encourages that level of public responsibility for your community. And I was thinking back to what you said about if it is a space that's owned or managed by a public organisation, should you try and communicate with the local authority, for example? Is it difficult to get hold of the relevant person?
In my experience, it hasn't been too difficult to find the right person, but it has been difficult then to pin down any form of agreement. I think what I like about guerrilla gardening is the complete autonomy and freedom of it. And I also really believe in empowering communities from the grassroots. So I think, we should have the right to plant outside our front doorstep. So you can engage with the council if you want to go around that way, if that would make you feel safer. And that would make you feel more confident in what you're doing. And I would still count that as guerrilla gardening, because I call guerrilla gardening kind of, planting in public places. I think defining it in terms of permission gives the council the power. If the council is saying, yes, you can do it, or no, you can't do it, say unbeknownst to me, I was guerrilla gardening my street and the council just changed their mind halfway through my action as to like, oh no, we didn't allow it before, but now we're going to allow it. The meaning of what I'm doing doesn't change. So I think you can absolutely engage the council if you want to and still, feel good about what you're doing. Is still guerrilla gardening. But I personally, it's not something I do. I can't be bothered. Having worked in council myself, I know how much red tape there is. I know how difficult it is for them to say something because they're next on the line. There's always going to be someone in the community who has a go at them, or, God forbid, like tries to sue them or whatever for doing these things or for agreeing to these things. So they are very hesitant to take what they think is a risk on something like this. So that's in their favor, but also to their detriment. They don't really trust the community enough. They don't think the community knows what they're doing. And there is so much talent and so much knowledge within communities that I really think we should be given more credit and more respect. So it's basically long answer short. It's up to you. You might be tearing your hair out by the end of trying, though.
Fair enough. Yep, I got you. I do understand what you're saying. So moving forwards, if people are interested in this, and obviously your book is fantastic. It really is. It's really comprehensive and I loved it. But if people are interested, is there anywhere else that you would point them towards if they want to get involved?
If you want to get involved in guerrilla gardening, so I run an organisation called Dream Green, which provides guerrilla gardening workshops, guides. We've done grants before where we've given micro grants out to various communities to create their own guerrilla gardens. I would advise you just to look around your area to see if there's a local guerrilla gardening group, and there probably is. It might be a case of just kind of searching the guerrilla gardening hashtag on Instagram or asking around the local community. But once I've started talking about guerrilla gardening to people, either they won't have heard of it, or, one time out of 5, let's say, they'll be like, oh, I've done that. And yeah, if you start looking for guerrilla gardeners around you, you'll probably be surprised just how common it is. And if you want to get guerrilla gardening, so I've mentioned Dream Green, but it's not, guerrilla gardening's not, it's kind of a global movement, but there's no kind of guerrilla gardening authority. There's nothing you have to subscribe to or sign up to or anything like that. It's not like a kind of Extinction Rebellion thing. It's like painting, for instance. To do it, you just have to do it. So if you want to get involved in guerrilla gardening, just get guerrilla gardening.
What are you waiting for? Thank you to Ellen for coming on the podcast and sharing her knowledge of this incredibly powerful tool we have to disrupt and reclaim our urban spaces, for both us and for nature. And thanks to you for listening. Next up is Dr. Ian Bedford, talking about the potential one particular bug has to elevate us to superhero levels of invincibility.
In habitats throughout the world, a remarkable 45,000 different species of spider have so far been discovered, and 650 of these reside in Britain. Besides their key features of having 8 legs and a venomous bite, all spiders produce silk, and they use their silk for different purposes, such as creating egg sacs, traversing surfaces, and for wrapping up and storing their food. But probably the most well-known use of their silk is to create webs that are usually suspended between structures for catching their prey. However, not all spiders use webs for this purpose, since some make them into protective canopies for their young, whilst others lay them on the ground, where they work like tripwires to alert the spiders to danger or prey. And there's even spiders that don't make any webs, but just rely on their stealth and camouflage for ambushing their victims. But for those that do make webs, they'll follow a distinct format, ranging from orbs and sheets to lace and funnel shapes. And the web's architecture will often be so unique that it'll reveal the family or even the species of spider that created it. How these spiders instinctively build their webs, though, remains one of the fascinating enigmas of the natural world. But this innate behavioural trait has clearly become hardwired into their DNA over the 100 million years that we know from specimens within ancient amber they've been using silk to trap their prey. Spiders produce their silk from a gland inside their body, and it's stored as a liquid inside their abdomen. Then, when required, the spider uses its rear legs to push the liquid out through tiny pores called spinnerets, where, as it emerges, it rapidly dries into a little silk thread. A thread that research discovered is amongst the strongest and most resilient natural fibre that's ever been found, which unbelievably is 5 times stronger than steel. And when it's made into a mesh, it's tough enough to stop a small bullet. It's also very elastic and incredibly lightweight. So if ways are found to mass-produce spider silk cost-effectively in the future, then our 8-legged acquaintances from the natural world may well have given us all the potential to protect our bodies with clothing that previously might only have been seen in a comic book.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.